let's say they're a psychiatrist and they have a psychiatric malpractice policy, and then they open up a ketamine therapy section of their business, and they don't bother to tell their agent or they don't bother to tell their carrier that they're providing the ketamine therapy now. Well, if you didn't do that, you know, just don't assume. Always double check. And the main reason that people don't is just like you dealing with your auto insurance or homeowners insurance, nobody likes to deal with insurance. Just that word, it's awful. Nobody nobody likes to mess with it.
Three, two, one. Liftoff.
Welcome to the Ketamine StartUp Podcast. This is where we talk about how to start up a ketamine clinic, market it, and more. In this episode, we interview Canyon Clifton, CEO of Clifton Insurance Agency, a professional liability and high-risk niche market insurance corporation founded in 1982 by the Clifton family. We cover the biggest insurance mistakes ketamine clinics make, essential coverage types beyond malpractice, and the real-world claims process, plus more. Before we jump in, I want to disclose that Canyon and Clifton Insurance Agency are trusted sponsorship partners with us. And this episode is for educational and informational purposes only and should not be considered professional insurance, legal, or business advice. Sam had a good time on this episode, and we both learned a lot from Canyon and hope you do too. So let's jump into the episode.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about our guest today. And you've already heard his intro, so we're going to skip that portion. And we're just going to go straight into getting all the insights about insurance, malpractice coverage, business coverage, anything insurance related, because Canyon really is the expert in this space. So welcome to the show, Canyon.
Well, thank you so much, Doc. We appreciate it. And I'm definitely happy to be here.
So the first question I have for you is, what is the biggest mistake that clinicians, doctors make in regards to insurance?
Well, I would definitely say that the number one thing is that they may just assume that they're covered for ketamine-based malpractice coverage on their current policy, or we do, in our business, we see a lot of people that are purchasing policies online, whether they're an NP or a PA or even an MD, whatever it may be, and they just kind of assume that they're covered for that because they're told either, number one, that everything is covered within their scope of practice, but they don't read the fine print on the policies or actually discuss something with an agent or a broker. So come to find out, they may or may not be covered. So it's definitely always good to get that in writing or listed on your certificate of insurance or policy just to make 100% certain that you are covered.
Yeah, and where do doctors and clinicians, NPs, PAs, whoever's where is that? Because I've reviewed insurance documents, Canyon, and those bad boys are thick. They're 100 pages, and in a way, it seems like it's meant to be confusing. So where would someone look for that?
Right. Typically what you're going to look for, it's really carrier specific, but a lot of carriers will name it specifically in the policy. Or what you really need to hone in on is reading over the exclusions section of the policy. Also, a very easy thing to do is you can have that ketamine therapy is specifically listed, or whatever procedures you're actually doing are specifically named and listed from your agent or carrier on the certificate of insurance that you do receive. That typically is just a one-page accord form. That's just kind of a blanket page, stating that you do have coverage. So if the agent or the carrier does put that on the certificate of insurance, that way you'll have that noted, and it's very easy for you to see.
Do insurance companies typically feel comfortable with putting that on that one-page accord document, or do they push back on it in the past, from your experience?
Insurance carriers don't issue the certificates of insurance. They only issue the actual policies. So the agent that you're working with or the broker that you're working with should be able to add that specifically to your certificate of insurance if you do request it. Also, you have to remember that whenever you're filling out applications for insurance, typically those policies are bound based on all of the information that you provided on those applications. So the applications themselves actually become a part of the policy. So unless you're seeing some type of exclusion, for it specifically in those policy documents, and, like you said, those policies can be anywhere from 45 to 80 pages long, you can be sure to ask your agent, broker, if there are any specific exclusions that they should look for and where they could be located in those policies to make sure that, something isn't excluded.
Wait, this is really fascinating to me. I want to double click on this. So, the application that the healthcare provider fills out actually becomes a part of the insurance documents. Is that what I'm hearing?
Right. If you want to make it simple, they're kind of like if you were building a house, they're your floor plans in essence. So whenever you're completing an application, number one, if you are applying, for either new ketamine clinic insurance for a group or for an individual, you want to look over that application that you're completing to see if there are any specific questions having to do with psychiatric care, having to do with ketamine therapy, TMS, anything like that. And also look at the back of the application because on most of the applications, there's going to be what's called an additional explanation section. So you want to make sure whenever you are completing one of those applications for your agent or broker that you are listing all of the services that you are seeking coverage for because that's your simple way of knowing that you did inform the agent that you are doing this. And that way, again, if you have it on the application and then you purchase the policy, you purchase the coverage, and you get a certificate of insurance, if it's truly covered, the agent or broker should be able to list that ketamine therapy and your services are listed on the certificate. And then again, go over that with your agent, go over the policy, look over the exclusion section just to make sure that something specifically is not excluded.
Now, this is a really new space or fairly new space. I mean, back, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it was very, very brand new with ketamine therapy. And what I experienced back in the days when I first started it, there was pushback from the insurance company. And what have you noticed as far as like the landscape? Are insurance companies becoming aware of this? And they're like, oh, yeah, I get what they're doing. It's off label. Like, is there a shift that you're noticing in the overall regulatory insurance space?
Right. It's really all insurance carrier specific. I mean, there are different types of insurance carriers out there. There are admitted based carriers, and then there are non admitted based carriers. The most important thing to look for, obviously, is an A plus rating from that insurance carrier. But typically, in the non admitted based category, you're going to find that a lot of the A plus rated carriers are going to be a little bit more flexible or lenient in designing a policy specifically for you, not necessarily just for ketamine, but for all of the other treatments that you may be doing. So, I think at the very beginning, when, ketamine in our industry, ketamine really got noticed about 4 years ago. So then in the beginning, there was a little bit of pushback, but what we find is that the carriers, as they become more educated on it, and as more people start requesting that coverage on their policies, once the carriers have started doing their diligence, they realize that it is a great form of therapy, and they have become a lot more lenient on covering that. Especially if the providers or clinical practitioners are fully licensed and capable of handling these types of procedures.
And what is the difference between admitted and non-admitted? Is that you brought up? I've heard that term, but I'm not
Right.
sure what that means.
Well, an admitted based carrier is basically, just to keep it simple, they're a carrier that files all of their pricing and they file all of their coverage directly with the state. So whatever state, you know, the the practitioner is practicing in, if you're purchasing an admitted based policy, whenever you purchase the policy from that carrier, what that carrier does is they put a certain amount of money into the patient compensation fund. And basically, what that means is that if for some reason your carrier was to ever go insolvent or you were ever to have a problem with a claim, the state patient compensation fund or the state guarantee fund would step in and pay for that claim. Um,
That's admitted
that's
insurance,
admitted.
and then
Right.
non-admitted. Okay.
Right. So that's with a carrier that typically likes to do a lot of business with the state and rely on the state on the patient compensation fund or stabilization fund to step in if there were going to be an issue with the carrier paying claims. Now, a non-admitted base carrier is also a great carrier, but what they've basically decided is that they don't really want to have the states telling them how to set the pricing on their policies. They don't want to utilize the state compensation fund or the state guarantee fund. What non-admitted carriers do is they basically purchase what's called reinsurance. So every time you purchase a policy from a non-admitted carrier, what they do is they take a portion of the money that you paid, they set aside a certain amount of money to pay your specific claim, and they also diversify all of their holdings with reinsurance partners, reinsurance carriers to help share in that risk. So instead of utilizing the state like an admitted carrier would, they're utilizing other large multi-billion dollar A plus rated carriers to back them to diversify and spread that risk out. Now, a non admitted carrier has to abide by all the state insurance guidelines and the National Association of Insurance Commission guidelines. They're just choosing not to have the state have anything to do with their pricing or rely on the state for any type of claims assistance if they were to run into trouble. So both carriers are great, and there are different reasons for using, each type of carrier. It just depends really, what's best for you in your state, and what you feel the most comfortable with.
Got it. Thank you for that clarification. And that
Sure.
is interesting because as clinicians, we don't really know these terms and it can be really confusing. So I think just talking with you, Canyon, and kind
Yeah.
of it's like a language. Like when we go to med school, we learn new terms. And it's, there's like the doctor's language. Like I could call a bruise, or I could call it
Yeah.
an ecchymosis, right? And so
Sure.
it's sometimes there's a simple language and then there's like the technical, more jargon, which can be challenging, especially for clinicians, because we're trying to see patients, take care of them, and hopefully never having to use insurance.
Oh, sure.
But
Yeah.
if that's the case, I mean, we got like malpractice insurance. That's probably the number one, you know, things that doctors and clinicians are aware of. So there's malpractice. But you also mentioned in an earlier conversation that there's other insurances to consider beyond malpractice. So tell us, like, what are some of the other things that I don't know, and I know there's a bunch. So let's say like the top 3 or 4.
Oh, well, it really depends on the type of practice. Now, if we're talking about a full-blown ketamine clinic, that has 2 or 3 providers or even 1 or 2 providers providing ketamine, and that's their main source. They've got a rented space. They're mainly focusing on ketamine therapy. The way to break it down is, number 1, you wanna have professional liability insurance to cover your entity, whether that's an LLC, PLLC, S corp, whatever that may be. So you're gonna have the professional liability to cover your entity. You're gonna have the medical malpractice insurance to cover the, clinicians, the active providers that are treating patients. Then you're going to have medical director liability if you do have an overseeing medical director, somebody that may just be a part of the practice, doing supervisory or administrative duties, and they're, in case of an emergency. Then number 4, we're looking for the general liability coverage, which is your basic slip and fall type coverage. That would all be encompassed under, a group policy. And then, underneath that professional liability insurance belt, you're also going to have things like board action defense coverage, license protection, sexual discrimination coverage, and things like that. Things to cover your license, things to cover anything, that could come out of the blue having to do with a patient complaint, some kind of board action review. All of that is typically going to be encompassed under, one policy, for a group. Now there's other policy enhancements that you could purchase separate coverage for, like EPLI, employer practice liability insurance, which would be the type of insurance that you would provide if, let's say, you had a disgruntled employee and they filed a lawsuit against you for wrongful termination or something like that. Then we've got, we can set you up with workers' comp based insurance for accidents on the job, those types of things. So, groups have a lot of flexibility. Now, on individuals, we can do the same thing. If they have a physical location, we're going to set and an entity, we're going to set them up with all the same coverage, but it's going to be on an individual basis and cover their entity. We just wouldn't be covering any other employees other than maybe that of a 1099 medical director. And most of the medical directors that we do see are, 1099 contractors. So either way you slice it, whether you're a group or you're an individual, I mean, we can package together a specific policy to get you exactly what you need.
And then there's like bonus stuff, right? You mentioned enhancements like cyber, I know like
Oh, yeah.
with my insurance, there's like cyber liability and, all sorts of other like, oh, I didn't even know an insurance existed for that. So
Yeah.
it almost reminds me of like buying a new car. And,
Yeah.
when you buy the new car, they're like, oh, you could get insurance for your tires and you could get
Oh,
insurance
yeah.
for this. And so what are some of these extra like bonus ones that people may not be, that you're like, oh, yeah, maybe you should get this bonus one or the enhancement one that can be
Well,
useful.
that's a good question. And in today's market, one of the top things that you need to look for or potentially look to add is the cyber liability coverage. If you're collecting a lot of patient data, you're a pretty good sized clinic, You're emailing a lot of a lot back and forth with confidential patient information, and you're taking a lot of payments, especially, credit card or ACH debit payments through an online portal or over the phone where a transaction is taking place online. It's definitely a good idea to get some cyber liability coverage. And, if you're an individual or, just a group that has a couple of people, cyber liability is a pretty cheap thing to purchase. But really, it's something you want to go for if, like I said, if you are taking a lot of patient information over email and you're taking a lot of payment transactions. So either way, for an individual or a small part-time based clinic doing ketamine, you could probably take out a cyber liability policy for 300 or 400 bucks a year. And then we see some of the larger ketamine clinics, paying anywhere from 1,500 to 3,500 a year for a pretty in-depth, comprehensive base cyber policy. So that's definitely
Okay,
something good to consider.
thank you. And you've been doing this. I believe your company was started by. It's like a family business, and you started in the 1980s, 1981, I believe.
Correct.
Or
My
what are
late
your?
my late father, who was a CRNA, he started this business kind of as a side hustle back in 1981, which coincidentally was the year I was born. So I guess I was a pretty easy child, and he didn't. They didn't have too much to take care of. But that totally changed when I became a teenager. So they needed all hands on deck for that. But we've been, a niche market agency for the past 20 years, really, really honing in on specific areas of practice like ketamine therapy and working with all sorts of niche medical clinics nationally and individuals.
And what inspired you personally, Canyon, to find this niche? Because it is a very niche market for sure. Like, because we don't see a lot of insurance agents who, have that webpage that's focused for people in ketamine therapy. So, what inspired you to even like consider, working with people in this space?
We've been doing a lot of work with psychiatrists and psychologists all over the country. So again, about 4 or 5 years ago, we really noticed kind of an uptick in a request for ketamine therapy. So we were kind of the front runners with our agency here at Clifton Insurance, kind of spearheading discussing and opening up the conversations with these malpractice carriers about what ketamine therapy is and how that can be integrated into the wellness category. So we just found it very interesting. I also have a minor in psychology along with our business degree. So I was just very interested in it. And I've always been very interested in helping people, not only just, providing people with malpractice insurance, but I really do. And my entire team really does like to dig deep and focus on things that we're passionate about. So after doing a lot of research and getting some feedback from a lot of our clients, we really did get excited about making this kind of a turnkey agency specific for ketamine therapy. I mean, we have access to every malpractice carrier out there that writes for ketamine. We're probably the front running agency, I would say, in the US that has the most knowledge base in this space. So we just love it. And we love working with the providers that provide this. And, that's pretty much it. We really just kind of fell in love with it and made it a big key to our business here.
Thanks for sharing that, Canyon. Yeah, I could tell you're very passionate about this space, which is specifically the reason, we wanted you on the podcast. Now, I would love to hear, since you have been in this space, what insurance issues have come up? Like specifically, like have you seen malpractice lawsuits? Have you seen professional liability stuff? Have you seen commercial liability stuff like cyber liability? Like, and specifically regarding ketamine clinics, like what have they used and what are some of the cases that you've noticed?
Honestly, you and I had a discussion about it a little while back. We honestly haven't really seen a whole lot of claims come through specifically as a result of ketamine therapy. Most of the claims that we see come through, I would say on the malpractice side, were that let's say, just as an example, the patient had a therapy session and then they were left alone for specific period of time where they were not checked up on and they had an adverse reaction. And, that did result in a malpractice claim. As far as an actual malpractice claim, having to do with the specific ketamine, the drug, we haven't seen anything really come through yet on that end. Most of the claims that are coming through are the basic general liability, like slip and fall type claims, such as they had a therapy session, client got up and was left unattended for a little while, decided to go to the bathroom, slip and fell and had an accident. Those are the types of things that we're seeing. whenever there is what we call an incident, which is not necessarily a lawsuit yet, but we have an incident or a claim. Claims, obviously, you're being sued. The easiest way to protect yourself is to obviously, number one, keep the best documentation that you can possibly keep. Take the notes, take the records, provide the informed consents, make sure that you have all of that, documented, and then make sure that, your staff is educated on how to treat these patients before and after the ketamine therapy session, and basically do all that you can just to nurture those people to make sure that they are well protected so that you can, mitigate that risk and, prevent any type of issues from ever happening in the first place. So a lot of the claims that we do see, are coming through just from clinics that may not have taken the necessary steps to educate themselves on how to better prevent lawsuits and kind of focus on, risk mitigation versus actually the practice of, ketamine therapy. Does that make sense?
And this, yeah, totally makes sense because it reminds me of a story that a mentor, he's another doctor, and he had been practicing emergency medicine for 30 years. And he said, and the average ER doc in the emergency field, this is not ketamine therapy, gets sued. I don't know. I think the statistics are like once every 7 years on average. And he said, well, I've been practicing for 30 years, Sam. I've never had anyone do a lawsuit against me. And he said, I'm going to tell you the secret. And this is my first year out of residency. And so I just finished my training. And he said, you have to really care about the patient and they have to be able to sense that. And he said that they're willing to forgive mistakes, but a lot of lawsuits from his experience was poor interpersonal communication, right? Dismissiveness, dismissive of the patients, not listening to their concerns. It was the relationship that created the lawsuit, not necessarily the mistake, because, doctors, we're human, humans make mistakes. So it was kind of a little bit less about that and more like, hey, once they did make an error, because that can happen, like how did they handle it post error? Like, was it a very caring, kind, empathic, compassionate way? Or was it like, hey, get out of my face. We didn't do anything wrong. No, kind of this gaslighting experience. So I think that interpersonal relationship between the patient and the clinician is actually huge. I mean, we call it risk mitigation, which sounds fancy, but it's just basically like doing the right thing and
Yeah.
caring about people.
Oh, 100%. I think you're, that doctor is absolutely correct. I think, a lot of these people, and I'm not just going to hone in on medical practitioners. I would say, whether you're an engineer or an attorney or an insurance agent or broker, I mean, you have to speak to people, in a certain way. You have to be accommodating. You have to realize that, this is your day to day. You're a ketamine provider, you're a medical practitioner, but the patient is not. The patient may not understand everything that you're telling them. So the best thing that you can possibly do is just to, like you said, act like you really and you really should. You should care about what you're doing. And you should treat these people with utmost respect. And I mean, make them laugh, make them feel comfortable, make them feel like you're excited for them to be there. And from what we've noticed, we have seen so many things, come through, not just with ketamine or anything else, but a lot of the medical providers that, were great, but then, they did a surgery or they did something and they had a pretty bad outcome. But the patient or the patient's family decided not to sue because they just felt like it was a mistake that happened, or it was an adverse reaction that happened in the operating room. That they knew the surgeon, they knew the doctor, they knew that they were doing everything that they possibly could. And because they felt comfortable and they felt like the medical practitioner treated them like a human being with empathy and respect, they don't file lawsuits. I would say probably 90% of the lawsuits could definitely be avoided if you would just, treat these people the way that you would like to be treated.
Yeah, and actually that brings up a good point. So let's suppose that there's a doctor or another medical practitioner who doesn't do these things, and now they do have a claim against them, and the patient's like, "Hey, you messed up. I'm going to sue you." And I don't know if you'd be able to walk someone through that process of like what happens post lawsuit and kind of what's the steps that occur after, in a worst case scenario, patient has a bad outcome and they're like, "Yep, that doctor was an a-hole. I'm going to sue them." Like, what's the process?
From what we gather, most of the medical providers know that something's going to go down relatively quickly, right after, the procedure has taken place, especially if it was a pretty bad outcome. From our point of view, we're not there, when they're visiting with the patient or the patient's family. But the first thing that you obviously need to do if you've had an adverse outcome is turn that into your insurance agent or your insurance carrier, whoever it is that you're working
Oh,
with.
even before the lawsuit.
If you have an inkling that, especially if there was an adverse reaction that resulted in someone going to the hospital or going to the ICU, it's always good if you have that gut feeling that this did not turn out the way it was supposed to, and I think that this could result in something. A lot of the malpractice policies out there, they're called incident sensitive policies. Especially, like, let's say there was a death or someone ends up in the ICU, they've gone into a coma for some reason, and I'm just giving you a few examples. But a lot of these policies are incident sensitive, basically saying, if within the first 24 to 48 hours you've noticed something that took place, you've gathered some information on it, and you know, you have that gut feeling that this potentially could turn into a lawsuit, it is a good idea to contact your agent or your carrier. Make sure to give them the patient's name, the date that the treatment or service happened or procedure, and let them know where it was done, and let your agent or your carrier know exactly what went down and what the status of the patient is now.
Why is it important to let them know immediately? Because you mentioned the word incident sensitive. Like, why not just wait and just like cross your fingers? Oh, I hope they make it out of the ICU versus
Yeah. Oh,
as an example.
yeah, well, I mean, really, and we've seen this happen multiple times, and it's kind of a little bit of a gray area, but, like we say, if you have an incident that happens and let's say you're doing a ketamine treatment and someone ends up going to the ICU and they go into a coma and they're there for 4 or 5 days, then the patient makes a recovery supposedly, and a full recovery, supposedly. But then let's say that patient goes to the doctor 4 or 5 months later for some other type of treatment, checkup, whatever it
The
is.
same doctor or a different
A
doctor?
different doctor. Let's say they go to their GP, general
Got it.
practitioner, and they're complaining about some type of migraine or some type of really horrible headache. And then the medical practitioner notices that they have some kind of brain tumor or they have something like that. Then that patient contacts an attorney, and that attorney says, "Hey, what type of medical treatments have you had over the last, 2, 3, 5 years?" And then the ketamine therapy comes up. And they say, "Well, yeah, I had a 2 or 3 ketamine therapy sessions done over the last couple of years. I ended up in the ICU, this happened." And then that plaintiff attorney is like, interesting, okay." So then what that plaintiff attorney can do then is decide to file a lawsuit against the ketamine therapy clinic. And if the ketamine therapy clinic had, knowledge that there was a very adverse outcome that took place with a patient, a year ago, 4 or 5 months ago, and they didn't make their insurance carrier aware, well, depending on what carrier you're with, that carrier could potentially, kind of throw that back at you and be like, "Well, you have a ketamine clinic and you had a patient go to the ICU. That is not normal. They had to be, sent to the hospital in an ambulance. Why didn't you make us aware of this?" And then the ketamine clinic can say, it just we thought that the patient was fine. It looked like they made a full recovery. Well, come to find out, maybe they didn't. And maybe the ketamine therapy had absolutely nothing to do with, what happened to them in the future. But it's just always a good idea to dot your I's and cross your T's and let your agent or your carrier know if there was an outcome that took place that is non-standard, just to
Got it.
protect yourself.
Hey, listeners, this is Kim, and I just want to acknowledge that you're here for a reason. Maybe you're stuck in a cycle of long shifts, feeling a little burnt out, and wondering if there's any other way to practice medicine, especially on your own terms. We've been there, and that's exactly why we created this free checklist, your step-by-step roadmap to starting a ketamine clinic without those costly mistakes. Grab your copy now at www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist. It's completely free because we want you to succeed, not struggle. And hey, if you're driving or mid-workout, don't sweat it. Just check out the show notes for the link when you're ready. And again, that's www.ketaminestartup.com/checklist. Now let's get back to the episode.
Okay, so let's go back to this scenario. The patient had ketamine, bad outcome. Now there's an attorney and they're saying, hey, we're going to sue you.
Right.
And then the insurance gets involved. And let's say that was part of it because they had coverage. And then, because you mentioned something on a previous conversation about, various clauses, like the one that really stood out. And I wanted to ask you about something was like the hammer clause. So tell us like how things, because I believe that the vast majority of these lawsuits actually get settled and don't go to court.
Yeah, I would say probably about 95% of these cases never actually end up going to court. So what's going to happen if you're actually formally sued? You're going to be served with paperwork, obviously. then what you're going to need to do with that paperwork immediately is turn that directly into your insurance agent or your carrier. And then what they're going to do is they're going to, if you turn it into someone like us, an agency, we're going to turn that into your malpractice carrier. Then your malpractice carrier is going to reach out to you. And the malpractice carrier is also going to reach out to the plaintiff law firm that is working on behalf of the plaintiff that has decided to sue you. So your malpractice defense counsel is going to step in. They're going to start working with you. They're going to start working with the plaintiff attorney, and they're going to start really getting into what we call the discovery period. Like what the heck happened and why did it happen? And let's start gathering information from both parties. So they're going to go through that discovery phase. They're going to want you to provide them with all of the emails, all of the medical records, any type of information that they can have to kind of formulate the basis for a defense. And then the plaintiff's counsel is going to be obviously wanting to use part of that to form it as their, justifying reason for the lawsuit itself. And then after that, you're going to kind of go back and forth between your defense counsel, their plaintiff counsel, kind of bouncing it back and forth to find out exactly how this is going to go down. So once they've gone through the discovery period, the plaintiff attorneys may come back on behalf of your patient that is suing you and say, hey, what we can do is we want to settle this for $250,000 and we'll make this go away. Then your defense counsel is going to advise you as to whether or not they think that's a good idea or if that type of settlement should be made. Your defense counsel and your insurance carrier are going to work very closely together to figure out exactly how this claim needs to be handled. And yes, a lot of the carriers do have what's called a hammer clause. And what that clause basically says is that if your defense counsel and the insurance carrier have gone over all the details, the plaintiff counsel for your patient that's suing you has told you that they want $250,000, your defense counsel and the insurance carrier are going to decide on the next best course of action, because one of the most important things that you don't want to have happen is you can continue to fight it and go years and years and years, but what you're going to do is you're going to rack up a ton of money in legal fees. And then you know, the insurance carrier is basically going to decide, well, are we going to pay out more money in legal fees, knowing that we're still probably going to go to court and still going to have to settle this claim with the plaintiff and their client? Or can we, let's say, offer them, $100,000 today, knock out the defense fees, get this all wrapped up, and keep the monetary settlement, at the most minimal amount possible on what's called your loss run statements or your MPDB report. As most medical practitioners know, whether you are, found guilty or not guilty, any type of settlement that you have, on your MPDB report or loss runs report is always going to kind of hang over you for the next 5 to 10 years when you're applying for your malpractice coverage. Now, that I'm not in any way, shape, or form saying that if this is a completely frivolous lawsuit and you're being sued and you did not do anything wrong whatsoever, it's definitely up to you and your defense counsel and the insurance carrier to fight that on your behalf with however, whatever makes you feel comfortable to make sure that you are protected. And we do see a lot of frivolous claims get dropped, and they will be dropped. So that's good if that is the case. But your defense counsel is going to be able to tell you pretty quickly whether or not they can get that settled and dropped for you, probably within the first year, or I would say 18 months max, once
Yeah.
you've gone through
So,
all the discovery period.
so what I'm hearing is the hammer clause gives the insurance company an option to say, hey, it's going to cost way more to run this out for 10 years of legal. And so they, in a way, can force the doctor to settle it. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, they typically they can do that, and again, that depends on the carrier if they do have a hammer clause, because your the defense counsel that your insurance carrier is going to hire for you. They're not just going to hire anybody. They're going to hire a fantastic law firm in your state that knows ketamine, that knows the business, that is specifically designed for medical malpractice defense. So if your defense counsel is telling you, hey, based on all of the information that we have, we're either going to settle this or we're going to go to court. And if we go to court, we could end up losing $250,000 or have to pay that out on your behalf. And over the next, 8 months or a year for us fighting this, we're going to rack up another 75K in legal fees. So, basically the best thing that you can do is take the advice of your legal counsel if you do feel comfortable with them. And while you're going through these lawsuits, it's not like you're just going to be doing this over email. You're going to be meeting with people in person, doing the same thing that we're doing now, either doing Zoom meetings or meeting at their office, however that works. And, they're going to advise you on the best way to go. But that's the thing that you don't want to have happen is you don't want to have a claim drag out for another 2 or 3 years, rack up an additional, $125,000 in legal fees, and then have another, large medical malpractice settlement that settles either when you go to court or right before you go to court. Because if on your loss run statements or your NPDB report you show a loss of, let's say, 150,000 versus a loss of 800,000, well, having a loss of 150,000 is a lot better than a loss of 800,000.
Because it's gonna cost more, because if they have a lawsuit and then they're like, "Hey, you had to spend $800,000 on this previous one, now we have to charge you more," is that how that works?
Yeah, that's definitely how it'll work. And again, the way the carriers price the policies is all, price determined, on their appetite for that risk. But yeah, anytime that you have a higher settlement on your loss run statements, now the only exception for that would be if you have loss run statements or an NPDB report and there was, let's say, $150,000 worth of legal fees because you decided to fight it, but then you did show that, you were dropped from the lawsuit, then that obviously is a good thing.
Got it.
That the insurance carriers will look at that and they'll say, "Okay, you did what you were supposed to do. You worked with your defense counsel. You guys did defend it. It took a little longer than expected, but it was dropped." But whenever these insurance carriers, and this isn't their first rodeo, whenever they work with your defense counsel for, these lawsuits, the defense counsel is going to know pretty quick after a good amount of discovery what your best course of action is going to be. And there's also a lot to be said about getting something settled if it provides you with a lot of mental clarity and it'll get you back to really focusing on your practice versus dragging this lawsuit out for another 2 to 3 years. But again, I'm not an attorney. I'm just giving you information based on what I've seen. And I've seen people go through a lot of lawsuits. Some of them have taken, a year to settle or to be dropped. And then some have, gone on for 6 to 8 years. It really just depends. But I don't think that people in the ketamine therapy space should really be too worried about lawsuits dragging out that long just because it's a relatively non-invasive, it's not a cardio surgery or a neurosurgery, with multiple areas for complication or, maybe even hundreds. So the best thing that I can reiterate is that you need to feel comfortable with your defense counsel, comfortable with how your insurance carrier is working with your defense counsel, and then make sure that they are giving you the best representation possible and guiding you on the best way to settle that claim.
This is really interesting, Canyon, because sometimes people may go for like the cheapest insurance, but
Oh,
then
yeah.
turns out that you get what you pay for, right? So they're like, I want the cheapest one. And then maybe if it is the cheapest, there's a reason why it's the cheapest and they're not going to adequately support you or they're going to be dismissive. Like that could, I imagine, happen unless you pay like like someone could go shopping at Nordstrom's or someone can go shopping at Walmart and they're just going to get a different quality of product or service, I assume.
Oh, sure. Again, I think, and I'll just kind of highlight on this topic, what we're seeing a lot of now is a lot of these insurance agencies that work with NPs or PAs or what we call in our industry, mid-level providers. A lot of the NPs and PAs, a lot of them are branching out into the ketamine space to integrate that into part of their practice. So they're purchasing coverage online, standard coverage that they can purchase online where they're going through a list of questions on the online questionnaire, not a full-blown application, and they're just assuming that they're covered because they think it's within their scope of practice. So they purchase something online and then kind of like you highlighted on earlier, they get a policy emailed to them 2 weeks later that's 50, 80 pages long. Well, 95% of the people do not take the time to read those policies. So the best thing that I can possibly advise you to do is if you're working in the ketamine space, if you're forming a ketamine clinic, if you are doing this as a full-blown business or even as an individual, it is good to work with an actual agent or broker with a hard copy application that you complete, you email back to the agent or broker for certain that you listed everything having to do with your practice, including ketamine, so that you know that you are covered. But yeah, we do see a lot of these groups that just assume that They're, let's say they're a psychiatrist and they have a psychiatric malpractice policy, and then they open up a ketamine therapy section of their business, and they don't bother to tell their agent or they don't bother to tell their carrier that they're providing the ketamine therapy now. Well, if you didn't do that, you know, just don't assume. Always double check. And the main reason that people don't is just like you dealing with your auto insurance or homeowners insurance, nobody likes to deal with insurance. Just that word, it's awful. Nobody nobody likes to mess with it.
Sorry, Canyon.
I mean, yeah, what the heck? So, but I mean, that's our job. And I know we're doing a podcast and all that, but people they typically will put the insurance on the back burner. They will literally they will go form an entire company, you know, get everything set up, and then 2 weeks before they're about to open, that's when they start emailing like saying, "Oh, we need to get insurance for our practice." And we're like, "Oh, okay, you're opening in 2 weeks. Well, there's some things to discuss." And it may come to find out that they've hired these providers and they've hired a lot of RNs and they've hired estheticians and they've done all this. We'll come to find out some of the providers that they've hired to do ketamine may not qualify with a lot of these malpractice carriers to actually render ketamine therapy. So it's always good to, have a business plan put together and then reach out to an insurance professional. You can go ahead and form your business and that's fine, but don't wait 2 weeks before you open. You may want to jump on it, 45, 60 days in advance just to make sure that you can get the kind of policy or policies that you need to protect you before you set a hard opening date.
So roughly a month and a half, 2 months before opening day to get, because there's, application processing time and looking
Yeah.
for coverage. Um, you know, and and I gotta admit something to you, Canyon, is I hate that form. You know what I'm talking about, right? That
No, you mean the
initial
application?
form, the application, yeah, the
Yeah.
application. Then I've seen, because I've looked for quotes in the past of like, oh, maybe
Yeah.
I should switch, and
Uh-huh.
that application form is a pain in the butt,
I
and
know.
that's is there a way to make that easier? Is there a way to like put it online or make
Yeah.
it a Google form or
I love
have
this question.
ChatGPT help you?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a barrier of a lot of people like switching, for example. Like let's say they
Yeah.
have their insurance and they're like, yeah, I want to switch, but dude, I got to fill out that 20-page application to, even start the quote process. So tell us about that and like if there's ways to make it even easier.
Well, I mean, most of all of our I would say all of our applications for like ketamine clinics or individuals are 100% fillable online. So, I mean, we can email you the application, but you can complete it then. So, I love that question because anytime I'm talking to a medical provider, like I went to go see my GP because I'm 43. So now there's all sorts of tests and all the stuff that they want to run on me because I'm, getting older. Every single time I go into my doctor's office, and I mean every single time, he's got 5 pages of questions for me to answer, going through all of these different things. And I asked them the same thing. I'm like, hey, I just completed this, 4 months ago whenever I was here for like, a bronchitis or something like that. Do I have to fill this out again? And they're like, oh, yeah, we got to have it every single time just to make sure that things are updated and you're providing us with all. I mean, that doctor or that medical provider is doing their due diligence to make sure that I'm providing them with all of my updated health information. So your insurance, while most people think that it might be like an intangible product, like you're just purchasing it because you need to have it in order to open, but it's not. So I would say a 20-page application might be a little extensive. Ours are typically like 8 to 9, but you literally should be able to sit down and complete that application within about 15 to 20 minutes if you know how your business is going to function.
Got it. And then in addition to the application, there's also like forms. You mentioned the NPDB. You mentioned lost runs. I know they also
Yeah.
require like, hey, look at all your past 5 years of insurance coverage and send us these forms. So
Yeah.
in addition to the application, there's
Yeah.
documents to upload.
What I will say is that if you're opening up a fresh clinic or if you're starting, even just an individual practice, the first part of getting set up on your insurance as a group or even an individual's, it's going to be a little bit more difficult. The insurance carriers that we're brokering these out to get you covered, they're going to want a copy of that application. They're going to want to see copies of your license, your resumes for your providers, those types of things. And then they're going to, want those NPDB reports just to have on record that you don't have anything in the past that, they may need to know.
Can I pause you right there?
Yeah.
Because we've mentioned the word NPDB, and what does that stand for again, Canyon? Just for
The
listeners who don't know.
The NPDB report is what's called the National Practitioner Data Bank report. That is basically a report that is tied to your medical license, where it doesn't show every single thing about you, but what that report will show is if you've ever had any kind of board action, any kind of license issue. It will show if you've ever had any type of malpractice lawsuit. So if you're a new practitioner that's just getting started out in the ketamine space, and let's say you don't have a policy that's covered you for ketamine, there's really no way for you to get any loss runs on a ketamine policy because you're just now getting started. So the only way for the insurance carrier to double check your background is if you provide an NPDB report. So, really the application, your medical licenses for the providers, maybe the owner's resumes, and an NPDB report, those are going to be the main four things that the insurance carriers are going to want. And that's really just for year number one. That's just to get you set up on a brand new policy. Now, when you come up for renewal and we email you 60 days in advance to get started on that renewal, they're not going to ask you for all of the same information. They're just going to ask you for a new application, kind of like a medical provider would if I go into their office for another checkup 6 months later. They just want to make sure they're up to date on all my medical records and what's going on, or make sure they know everything about me that's current. So what I say is that if you are completing the longer form application, and it is cumbersome, and we tell people to do this all the time, is save that copy that you completed for next year. It's fillable. So if you've already added in your company name and your address and your providers and you've kept it and it's fillable, then whenever it comes up for renewal, you can just go in, update that application, re-sign and date it, and send it right back to us. And it shouldn't take you very long at all. So it's all really just having to do with your, time management and prioritizing your insurance as a part of your business and making it easy on yourself just as you would anything else.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. It's really useful. I want to run another scenario by you. So, and this is not regarding the medical side, but more the commercial or business liability, because that's another important aspect. So, let's say, as an example, hypothetically, that there was a fire, right?
Right.
And now everything in the fire has destroyed the clinic and the walls and interior and maybe even some of your medical equipment.
Right.
So that would typically fall under commercial or business liability, I assume. And
Right.
yeah, and then there's different players, right? Because let's say you have the commercial liability insurance, there's been a fire, not caused by the individual who runs the clinic, but let's just say it's in some external fire. Because we're in California here, there's a lot of fires, for example.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So how does that play out with the insurance? Could you walk us through that process of, let's say there's like a fire and it burns down a portion of the clinic? What would that look like for starting the claims and all that jazz?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, just to, earlier I was highlighting on the type of group policies that we put together, providing the professional liability, medical malpractice, and the general liability section. Now, most of those policies, on a group policy that's comprehensive, that's providing the professional liability and the general liability, which is typically what we're going to set everybody up with. That type of general liability insurance under that policy is really only covering you for your slip and fall base risks. Like if somebody slips and falls and hurts themselves slips on a puddle of water, they get injured, that's really what that's for. Now, if you want to make sure that you're covered or your space is covered for like theft, loss, any type of damage, if you're renting a space, you need to take out what's called a renter's insurance policy. That also within that renter's insurance policy that can cover, damage to the rented premises, that can cover contents liability, your equipment, anything having to do with repairs. So that would be something that you would want to take out as a separate policy if you are renting a space. That would be something to consider if your landlord is not already providing it. Now, does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. So those are additional policies that people can buy. There's like the slip and fall policy, but then there's other policies that will cover the
Yeah.
rented space and the equipment, and then also I know
Right.
there's insurance called like loss of business income insurance, where
Yeah.
let's say there is a fire and it's going to take 6 months or 8 months to repair, and you're like, well, I can't see patients in this office
Yeah.
because all this XYZ stuff, the
Right.
damage, and then
Right.
doctors can actually get business loss of business income, I believe it's called.
Yeah, or like what they call business interruption insurance. That would be
Yes.
another word for that. I mean, there's a long list of different types of insurances that you could take out. But I think to back up just a tad, if you're renting a space and you have a landlord, what you may want to double check with your landlord is that if there is a fire in the building, let's say you left a candle burning and it destroyed your space, does the landlord's policy cover that because you are a tenant? Or do you need to take out a renter's liability policy that would cover your general liability, products, equipment, and damage to the rented space? So you can get a renter's policy pretty affordably, especially if you're a smaller clinic. Now, if you own your own space, if you own your own building, then you might want to take out what's called, a business owner's policy. Now, a business owner's policy is going to protect, and kind of like your homeowner's insurance. It's going to cover damage or loss or total catastrophe to the building to replace the building. It's going to cover all the contents inside, and then it would cover, any type of settlement damage for any type of general liability under that business owner's policy as well. If you do own a space, if you own the actual space, so that's the basic difference between the renter's policy versus the business owner's policy. So if you're communicating with me and you tell me that you have a renter's policy or you already have a business owner's policy, that means that we would probably exclude the general liability section off of your comprehensive policy because you don't necessarily need it through our policy because you already have that type of coverage through either your renter's policy or your business owner's policy. Now, most people typically will purchase a renter's policy or a business owner's policy from a company like a State Farm or a Farmers or somebody local that can be right on site if there were to be an incident happen, kind of within their area. Renter's insurance is a little bit more flexible. You can get a lot of those policies, pretty easily online just for renting a space. But with a business owner's policy, we can do those as well. But most people choose to get those from like a State Farm or a Farmers. That's really more in their wheelhouse. So just to make it simple is, if you have a renter's policy or a business owner's policy, and both of those cover general liability within those, our policy that's predominantly geared towards the professional liability and medical malpractice, we would probably exclude the general liability off of your coverage just because we don't want to have duplicate coverage and you don't necessarily need it on our policy.
Got it. And as far as like going back to, let's say someone does have business owners insurance and there's a fire, like there's various people involved, right? There's the insurance adjuster, there's an insurance inspector, and is there anyone else that would be a player? There's the person filing the claim. Like, are there any other players involved in that type of example?
Under a renter's policy, you would have the landlord that's probably involved, in
Yeah.
that. But really, I mean, when it comes to like a loss of the building or damage to a building or damage or loss to contents, it's really just going to be you and the insurance carrier, going
Got
back
it.
and forth. And then again, the landlord if it's a rented space.
And I'm curious, is there like I don't know what's the best way to put it, like certain biases or tendencies that the insurance company could have against the owner? Like, I'll give you an example. Like in health insurance, sometimes someone will have Blue Cross, Blue Shield, Anthem, blah, blah, there's hundreds of them, right? And then the patient has the insurance and the doctor's like, hey, you need to do XYZ. But then the insurance company says, no, that's not necessary. And you need to do. And so, as you can imagine, like health insurance wise, there's a lot of friction between insurance and doctors and patients. Do you think that type of scenario also applies in the business owners side or malpractice side? Like, is it similar or no?
I don't think it's that similar. I don't see a lot of bias, especially having to do with medical professionals on, in medical spaces. I think it kind of comes down to some of those things on what we call risk mitigation or what you could call as claims prevention, such as not lighting a lot of candles and leaving those unattended in your space. And we kind of run into a lot of that with medical spas and aesthetics clinics. So, just kind of doing what you need to do to protect your space and protect your patient. If you're renting a space and you're working directly with a landlord, you always want to make sure as well to inform your landlord of anything that's going on with the space. Like if you notice a drip in the ceiling or if the HVAC system isn't working properly, anything like that, you want to keep your landlord up to date with. So, yeah, just providing that, educating yourself on those risk mitigation tactics and claims prevention techniques, regardless of what it is, and just having some also basic common sense will help you out quite a bit. But, on the business owners' policies and the renters' policies, no, they're pretty easy to get. The only thing that might come back to bite you is if you've had a loss in the past where, you know, you had a building burned down because, again, you left a candle burning or you didn't do something that you were supposed to, and it was a pretty nasty settlement on the insurance company's behalf. You can still get insurance, but again, any type of loss is gonna kinda follow you to some extent, which could raise the cost of your insurance regardless
Got it.
type of
Yeah.
coverage it is.
And that kind of happens like with auto insurance, right? If someone gets into
Yeah,
multiple car accidents, then their premium or their monthly payment or whatever is going to get higher because they're like, this person got into a ton of car accidents. This
yeah,
person has never got into an accident. So I can
yeah.
see the similarities there.
Yeah, you're a higher risk to the insurance company, regardless of what type of coverage it is, if you've had losses. And another thing that insurance carriers look at is they also look at the frequencies of incidents and the frequencies of losses. So, if you've turned in 2 or 3 incidents over, let's say a year or 2 period, that will kind of follow you a little bit. And I know that that sounds kind of bad because you're having to turn in those incidents. Or if you've had a couple of close call claim scenarios or claims issues, over a couple of years, they might not have necessarily turned into lawsuits or they might have been dropped. But if the insurance carrier is kind of developing a pattern that you are more of a higher risk based on your previous history, that will follow you. If I was coming to see my GP and, my GP knew that I was a smoker and he had, told me to cut back, but they just knew that I was a higher risk because I was still smoking and it was causing problems. They just know that I'm a higher risk for certain types of issues like cardiac, anything having to do health wise. I'm deemed a higher risk. So that's the same way that the insurance carrier looks at it. You've had incidents in the past, you've had claims run ins in the past. Your policies are just going to be a little bit more expensive because you have had either losses or close calls.
But then I was going to ask, like, what if it's like a one time incident? Like, let's say it's that fire that happened because it was in Southern California
Yeah.
and they've never had a claim before, but hey, this fire wiped out the building.
Yeah.
Like, does that also affect the premium for when they're reapplying
No.
for insurance?
No, it shouldn't because that's what's considered what the insurance company they would basically call that an act of God, basically saying that that had nothing to do with you. Like with the horrific fires that California had happen. I mean, there was no way to prevent that. You know, if you have to evacuate the space and your building burns down, I mean there's nothing that you can do about it. There's nothing that you did either internally or externally on the outside of that building to prevent that catastrophic loss. So they'll either call it an act of God or they'll call it a catastrophic loss based on an act of God scenario, like that would be a fire or a tornado. Like in our area, Tornado Alley, we have tornadoes. We also have a lot of fires because it's very flat here and we get a lot of high winds. So really the only time that that loss is going to damage you is when, the insurance carrier feels like there was a loss to the property or a loss to your equipment based on something that you could have, or there's something that would have been preventable.
Got it.
You know what
Like
I
they were
mean?
lighting candles because they're a spa and there's like a
Yeah.
room, they call it the candle room with 1,000 candles.
Yeah, yeah, like this is our oil room slash fire therapy room, and it caught the whole place on fire.
We're doing
Yeah,
fire walking in the office.
yeah, I mean, that's definitely gonna do it, but I mean, we've seen people who they've been operating a medical spa or a ketamine clinic, and somebody accidentally veers off the road and plows their car right through the front lobby. I mean, that there's nothing that you could have done to prevent that. I
Yeah,
mean, and that's what the insurance is there for.
yeah,
That's
excellent.
what it should be there for.
So I want to honor your time and just ask you a few rapid fire questions, Canyon. And this is
Yes.
something we like to do, or just for fun, just to get to know you a little bit. So the first rapid fire question I have for you is: do you have a hidden talent or hobby that most people would be surprised to learn about?
Ooh, do I have, do I have a hidden talent or hobby? Got lots of hobbies. I also own a real estate development company and a construction business, so I love to build homes through our other companies, and I love to buy land and turn it into neighborhoods. So that's like my one of my favorite passions that I do with my wife named Kaki and our 3 children. We love to keep them involved in that. So that's definitely I kind of consider it a hobby, but it's also a blessing because I love to do it. And then, yeah, I think my kids would say that I'm just known for doing some pretty ridiculous voices from time to time.
Okay,
So,
now you have to do one for us.
well, it's I can definitely bust out a little bit. It's a little bit harder, but I always kind of do like, you ever watch Lord of the Rings, a long time ago?
Yes.
You remember that little character Gollum?
Yep.
Yep. I don't know if it'll pick up too much on the mic, but I can do that. Yeah,
Let's
pretty
do it.
good.
Let's hear it.
Okay, so just throw out some questions, and I'll try, or throw out a question and I'll answer it. I'll try to do it
Okay,
in
okay,
my
this is
best
gonna be fun.
Gollum voice.
All
Yeah,
right. So I'll actually this will be great because you're gonna do the Gollum voice, but then I'm gonna ask you one of these rapid fire questions. Okay,
yeah.
so the question is, if you could go back in time for a day, where and when would you go and why?
Oh man, that's trying to think how Gollum would answer that question. If I could go back to any date and time, mm, oh man, that's so hard to answer in a Gollum voice. I may just have to do
Okay, just
something.
skip it. We'll do the Gollum voice later. We'll just
Okay,
do that
I'll
as
I'll have to come back to that here in just a
come
little
back
bit.
to that. I just wanna hear where you would actually go.
Oh man, I think I would definitely have to go back to the probably just anything having to do with either the crucifixion of Jesus Christ or just go back to a time period when he lived, just to be around for that, just to see it. We're a Christian-based family, and that's where we're rooted in, and I think that would be definitely top of my list, to go back during the time period where Jesus lived, just to hear his voice, just to see him, and just to have that experience.
What
Uh,
miracle do you wanna see in person
what miracle do I want to see in person?
if you were to go back and to see Jesus?
Oh, I would probably wanna see the one where he, you know, cured the blind man to where to they I can't remember exactly what his name was, but, there was that gentleman who'd been blind his entire life, and then he asked Jesus to heal him and give him the gift of sight, and he did. And, it's noted. I think that would definitely be a miracle that I would love to see.
And, I know your work can be pretty stressful, maybe you're dealing with doctors and you're doing stuff. So what's your go-to way to, like, relax and chill out and de-stress?
Oh, I think, I definitely enjoy working out. And I think, running multiple companies, especially an insurance company where we are dealing with thousands and thousands of people, you just have to stay physically active and you have to get great sleep. You also have to eat correctly. You have to take care of yourself. Back when I was 20, 25, I just kind of, in the college period, I just kind of instilled that in myself that I was always going to take care of myself. You know, it's just a great habit to have, not only physically, but then, the type of food that you are putting in your body, the amount of sleep that you're getting. I just you've got to take time for yourself to relax, get off of your phone, you know, wrap up your podcast, enjoy that, and then go, take some downtime. With whatever profession you are, or whatever profession you choose, it's going to come with its level of stress. So you've got to make time for that. I mean, life's about living. It's not about working 24/7 because you can't take none of this with you when you leave.
Excellent. And, I totally hear you, that's awesome. So I do wanna get the Gollum voice.
Yeah.
So let's see.
Yeah. Let me throw
Alright, so
back
this
some.
is this is for the Gollum voice. What's one advice that Gollum has one piece of advice that Gollum has for medical practitioners in the ketamine space or insurance?
I would say, yes, precious. I would say always to treat people the way that you wants to be treated. That's not great. That's not great, but I mean,
Love
it's
it.
it's the best that I can rip out after talking for an hour. That's the best that I can whip out now. So whatever you guys think about that online, just remember I'm being put on the spot, and DM me, and I'll do some better ones later.
All right. Last question for you is where can people get to, if they're curious about exploring insurance, whether it's professional side, business side, et cetera, cyber liability,
Oh yeah.
workers' comp, like what's the best way to people to connect with you, Canyon, at Clifton Insurance Agency?
You know, the best way to connect with myself or my team is to visit our website. It's cliftoninsuranceagency.com. And then all you have to do is go to the medical section at the very top and scroll down to ketamine clinics and then submit, a 1 minute little questionnaire about you and your practice. And then we will get that instantaneously. And then what we will do is we will give you a phone call or shoot you a quick text letting you know that we received it, and then we will try to set a time to hop on a call, or we will send you an email with everything that you need to get started. And again, you can also reach us at our direct line at 877-212-4368. And you can either ask for myself or my brother Cooper Clifton. We're the two main players here that handle the ketamine clinics, but anybody in our office would be fully capable of helping anybody. And we encourage people to come to us. We love working with you guys. We are so well versed in working with people that are either currently in business looking to make an insurance change, or we're happy to educate you on the type of insurances that you need if you're a new clinic or a new provider that's just starting up. And I think one of the big things to realize about our agency as well is that, you know, we don't just work with one or two malpractice carriers. We work with about 12 to 13 that we've been, expressly hands-on, working with to help develop these policies, especially for professional liability and medical malpractice for either yourself as a group or an individual. So you guys come and see us and we'll be happy to walk you through it. We will treat you appropriately, and we will make the insurance process as painless as possible.
Thank you. And we promise to put all of Canyon's information in the show notes. So you can check below in the show notes and the summary. So that'll be all linked in. So you can just click on it as well. Well, thank you so much for your time, Canyon. It's been a pleasure and an honor. You've really shared with us some of kind of the background insider knowledge. And now that I know you personally, I feel quite comfortable reaching out for any questions. So thank you again for your time, Canyon.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being on, and we'll be happy to do it anytime. And again, don't hold me accountable to that Gollum voice. That wasn't great. But, I'll see if I can put something together that's a little bit better next time after I haven't been speaking so much. But wish you the best. You guys stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again or being back on again.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Ketamine StartUp Podcast. If you found this episode valuable, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps other entrepreneurial medical professionals like you discover the show and grow this community. For show notes and resources in today's episode, visit our website at ketaminestartup.com/podcast. We hope you enjoyed and learned a lot in today's episode. And remember, the information shared today is for educational purposes only. Always consult with qualified professionals regarding insurance, legal, and regulatory requirements specific to your state and practice. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.